Yeah, thanks, Hannah, for inviting me. Thanks for you turning up today. I thought it's actually a very good timing, like for me, because we just finished a project, and I thought it's perfect time to reflect on the project. So what we have now, what I will talk about, are basically key reflections on the DFG-funded project that we had. We had just handed in the report this month. It's called Key Food Choices and Climate Change. And it will bring you a bit of very much a marketing consumer behavior perspective. It's a very much disciplinary perspective that I will share with you today. However, these are very general takeaways that we have, right? So I think nobody will struggle really with the content, understanding what this kind of reflections imply to us. All right, so with that, I will dive in. Sorry, one thing I haven't said so far, for me is also new. I will have this lecture while sitting because I'm still a bit sick with a stomach infection, and yeah, it's just easier for me that way. So it's a new angle for me also. So if it's a new angle for you, just excuse it, yeah? All right. Yeah, I will keep that very brief, but I guess most of you know that that every food category is, and even every food item is linked to different CO2 emissions, right? And we know that basically that animal-based foods typically are linked to more CO2 emissions than plant-based ones. And this is also what you see here on the slide. You see that something like cereals, which we consume much more because the x-axis here is quantity, has the much smaller bubble in terms of CO2 emissions compared to beef, pork, and cheese, right? So I guess that doesn't come to a surprise to most of you. This is what life cycle assessment basically has shown us over the past decades. So thinking about this as a starting point, like how we can actually change the climate footprint of our foods, then we know that there's a there are many options out there what policy can actually do. And we have done this already before starting this project. This is from 2018, and there we looked at different kinds of climate policies for the food domain. And you see here that taxes and restrictions, unfortunately, I have not translated that slide or that graph. Taxes and restrictions are basically not accepted by a majority of consumers. That's what we see here. There's quite some resistance for that. The most interesting thing might be that taxes and restrictions are not accepted to a similar degree. But in general, we see that it's really hard to sell these kind of policy measures. And this is like a collection of many different types of framings of tax policies and restrictions. Still, on average, you see quite some resistance here. The other part is the information and nudging. And of course, these are cherry-picked nudges. You might know this is when you influence the choice environment in a purposeful way, right? By changing the setup to make certain choices easier. And of course, there are less and more accepted ones among them. The ones that we had in this study here particularly accepted. So we see they almost get to the level of informations, but we know in general that information and nudges can get a much higher acceptance than tax and restriction policies. So that's in terms of feasibility, a major takeaway that we had already before. And we are not the first and not the only ones to note that. So if you look at labeling policies, which of course the topic that I will talk about, which is CO2 footprint labeling, then you see that it's a bit of mixture of both, of information and nudges, because essentially you're giving information about the food products, but you also do that in choice environments, in a restaurant setting or in a supermarket where the products are labeled. So while making the choice, you are exposed to that information. So this could be classified as some kind of a system to nudge, as well as an information treatment or an educational treatment. And the interesting part about that is that labels generally in terms of climate policies are among the most accepted. If you go to different types of stakeholders, if you go to the political domain, you see that at least some years back, we see that there's broad support for labor policies among conservatives, liberals, all kinds of directions in politics. And it also works in the way that we think in economics always, that the ideal is an informed consumer, right? So why would you act against that? That's basically the definition of what we want. What neoclassical theory predicts is actually the case. And of course, we should take policy measures to make that actually a real world. So with that, labeling is of course interesting because it's a feasible policy. And that's also where I start basically my presentation, because when you look into labeling policies, you often find too superficial looks at that. And I think it's important to understand the preconditions we need for successful labeling. And the literature tells us quite a lot about this. And this is a basic theory that I really like in that regard. And it's a theory of having basically 4 preconditions in order to see any behavioral change. And these preconditions are, first of all, we need to pay attention to the label. Then we need to comprehend it. And comprehension doesn't mean I fully understand everything. I just understand what the message is. Okay, there should be some climate benefit here, right? And this comprehension is enough to actually influence our judgment later on. It doesn't mean that people actually think, oh, this is a better claim than another claim. It's a different debate on whether this kind of level of comprehension is here. Then it's about recalling the information during the choice. That's also something that doesn't come natural to many consumers, where they even struggle to compare prices across shops and so on. And then we have the judgment, which is, of course, on how much this information that I get from the label does actually matter to my choices, how much I feel I want to consider that. And the last one then would be finally the behavior. And we know a thing or two about it, of course. We know, for example, that if it's about paying attention to such labels, then it's about familiarity of the label. That's why we always talk about market penetration. The more relevant in a market the label is, the more likely consumers are paying attention to it and actually using it for their behavior. And of course, this also interesting, attention is independent of product type. Unlike the judgment, while the judgment, the same kind of information on different product categories can have a different effect in judging how it influences our behaviors in a conscious way. And this is a bit the outline that I have, right? I will go through these 5 preconditions and show you a bit on how we, with our project, contributed to it. That means I will leave out a lot of stuff instead of showing you like, oh, we have this 10, 12 papers that came from the project. It's more about a story now of 3, 4 that kind of link to this food CO2 labeling here. Okay, let me start with the first. That's attention. If you look into paying attention, then the most preferred way to research it, which is probably also the most elaborated one at the moment, is eye tracking, actually. And eye tracking is very simple if you do that on a computer screen. It gets more complex if you have a whole choice environment and have to map a whole landscape here that actually plays a role, right? But of course, there are also cheaper options out there, and we frankly use the relatively cheap one, which is called the mouse lab. A mouse lab is simply just monitoring the clicks people do on a platform. And since we are not Google, Amazon, or anything, we do it in a researcher way. We're not actually monitoring all clicks. We just monitor the clicks on a predefined surface that we have programmed in the website, right? So the way that looks here is that you see, for example, there are 2 products here. And then they can click on a row, and this is how we actually can monitor whether they wanted to look at the information, because only if they click on the row, the information becomes visible. That's typically called for us, it's called attribute non-attendance. We are checking the willingness to attend the information, right? It's a very conscious way to look into attention. Yeah, but of course we want to make it complex to mimic the real world in that sense. So we look typically at larger or more complex choices. This is still just 4 products, but it's all the information that is typically present in the online store on the 4 products. So this makes 25 attributes that you can find there, right? That already shows you some of the complexity we have in just choosing among 4 products. And then you can click on the information, you get limited clicks, but you can access this information, and we can, of course, monitor that by checking the number of clicks, but also checking how long they actually looked into certain information before they continued with the next click. Right, and there's no doubt that we can also influence attention at that, and you can show that here by having a simple design, simple experimental design. And this comes from these mouse labs that we often see people actually read information from the top to bottom. That's why attributes at the top are more attended to than the ones at the bottom. And This can be done by having a randomized IDM. That's how we do it in the control scenario, that you actually randomize the order of attributes here. And you have a purposeful order that you put the climate footprint at the very top of that whole, right? And see how that influences the information or the attention here. And yeah, we do that with group A and B. In one group, we have 4 bread products, and then we have an ordered mouse lab for the bread and a randomized order for the milk, and do that vice versa for group B. So what you find here is on the very left side, you see that this is the CO2 footprint in terms of attention and time that they spent on that information. And it's very similar for the numbers of clicks. So I will show you only the one for time now to be very brief here. And what you see is that they spent about 2 seconds before making a choice looking into CO2 footprints on average. How does that compare to other things? We see, for example, for the price, they look into that 5 seconds, right? Or quantity of the product, they look into that for 4 seconds. So of course, these are more attended attributes in the end. However, if you look into the best case you could say is that it's similar to individual nutritional values that are there in the product information, because they were also attended about 2 seconds. But in general, we cannot say that consumers, if they are presented to CO2 footprints in a very neutral way here without a specific salient label or anything, would be particularly attentive to that kind of information. And that we see for bread and milk. And of course, we can influence that, as I said before, with the design. If you check that now with the ordered mouse lab, then we see that here we have these 2 seconds for milk on the top left. And here the CO2 footprint actually goes, or the attention time to that goes actually up to 4 seconds if we go to the nudged option. However, that does not come without costs. And that's something you can also see clearly here. If you look at other attributes that were in there, it shows now the environmental footprint, which is, of course, very close to a CO2 footprint in terms of information. And we see that the time spent on environmental footprints goes down because we have now basically prioritized the CO2 footprint here. And it can go down from about 2 seconds to 1 second. So we are also hurting other product attributes by actually nudging attention to other ones. And this becomes even more clear if you look at relative time. And relative time means here relative to all the other product attributes. All right, that's a small dive into where we are at attention. Now I go into comprehension. And comprehension is about what type of labels are actually understood, because ideally consumers understand more of such labels, because it would mean a better informed decision, and it would also mean that they are able to make judgments on the quality of labels at some point, right? And that would be ideal, because we want people to compare, at least we want them to compare products, that product A and B can be compared regarding their CO2 footprint. And that's not always the case. If you look at the kind of labels that are out there, we have here on the left the climate neutral label, which of course we have quite some issues with the market here, of the functioning of this compensation market for these climate neutrality claims. And we also have issues with the understanding of consumers, and consumers often do not understand climate neutrality, or that it's a compensation scheme that is behind that. We have other ones, right? But climate neutrality claims, they are not rare. And Katjes has used them, other players that you could name in the food industry, but all of them are used. The next one is the CO2 reduction label. That's, for example, is used by Arla, the dairy company. They have basically promoted their milk products with it. And the idea here is that some reference that is not always transparent, but typically it's sometime in the past. And that means, of course, the worse you are in the past, the better your reduction claim now, right? That's at least the approach that Arla has at the moment for it. And I would not even call them a black sheep, but at least they are amongst the ones that already is able to monitor the value chains here. Then we have the next one, the CO2 footprint label, which is just putting out the CO2 footprint information. Like Oatly does that, for example, right? So a competitor of Arla in that sense, that if you think that oat milk is a substitute to cow milk. And from a consumer perspective, I think it's even worse, because here you would expect consumers to actually remember these kind of values and compare them, right? This is just information that consumers typically don't have. And they cannot compare it because the competitors of Oatly are not labeling it in that way. So this information is also really hard to get by. So they would need to know something about average LCA values here. And then there are best-in-class labels, which has certain definitions of product categories, and then you are just choosing whatever you consider a good standard within that product category. And we have the traffic light labels, which from consumer policy perspective are the ideal ones. They are very much interpretive, so they judge in the end. But it's not an accident that for Nutri-Score, this is often recommended from a consumer behavior point of view, simply because it has the idea of comparing products to each other, right, in a meaningful way. And of course, there are also issues there that you could have. Like, for example, these kind of color-coded labels are used in the car industry. And in the car industry, you had them that they said, okay, but there should be for each category of cars. So people would actually have one category for SUVs, one for other cars, for smaller cars, and then you get an A for SUVs. And of course, this is still worse than a C for smaller cars. But in terms of the labeling, how it works, no consumers looks behind that. Right. So the idea, of course, should be that we have a color-coded label that includes all food products in the end. And this is very much feasible from a conceptual point of view. So we also had studies on that, several ones, but one that I want to highlight here is by a colleague where I contributed. And we looked at comprehension of these labels. And you see that subjectively, consumers think they understand the color-coded label best. And if you do kind of quizzes with them in the most objective way that we could think of, then also we see color-coded labels are best understood. So in that sense, we clearly have a priority here from a consumer behavior point of view, what would be best from a comprehension point of view. Okay, for recalling, here I actually don't have a study from the project to show, but I will give you just a general idea. Because it's not always easy to recall information during decisions, even if it's in the choice environment and not at the exact point of time where you make the choice. And we can see things like here, they actually ask consumers that said they have been frequently exposed to CO2 labels on how they judge certain product categories in terms of CO2 footprint. And they had like a bit of a slider task, then they would assign climate damage points. And the order for most is quite all right. They think that beef is the worst in terms of climate, then comes chicken, right? And I could argue that tofu and eggs are not well placed here, but the general idea seems to be there for most consumers understanding that. However, the dimensions are very much off. Because if you compare lentils to beef, yeah, you're not talking about 1.4 times CO2 footprint, to talk about 20 to 60 times, right? So the basic problem is that these dimensions only depend on the quantitative understanding among consumers, which we really don't have at all. And that you can see in multiple studies on beef burgers. Yeah, I think the beef burger is worse, but to which degree? All right, judgment. And this is, I think, sometimes the topic where most people think what marketing and consumer behavior is about. It's about the idea that we can actually influence the judgment of consumers. And this typically starts when we think about conscious processing with things like labels that then influence our attitudes, or it influences our perceived norms of society, and that influences our intention and in the long run should also influence our behavior. And it does, of course. But it's, of course, this is from theory of reasoned action, which is only on conscious processing. There's, of course, also things that are not so conscious because theory of reasoned action is basically the classic what theory of planned behavior was derived from, that many of you will probably know. But of course, we know that food choices are not always planned behavior. They're not like buying a house, buying a car. They're not very rational choices in that sense. Right. So, of course, there's much that is done on trying to influence that, and there's, of course, looking into celebrity endorsements, right? That they can influence our perceived norms again, that is, and even our attitudes. And there's even research that looks into how much actually the climate knowledge that such labels would bring would actually influence our judgment. Something that feels obvious to researchers is not so obvious to the consumer. All right, then let me go to behavior, because that's, of course, where the fun part starts. And if you look at the behavioral effects of CO2 footprint labels, what we see in field studies is the effect is very, very limited. We see that sometimes here in the first one, the temple is a restaurant scenario, I think, where they actually started with CO2 footprint labeling, and what they saw is that in the end, their food choices in this restaurant were associated with 2% less CO2 emissions. And we have similar findings in different other field settings, in supermarkets, in canteens. Here you have Babakani, Brunner, Koteleinen, Spararan. They all have very limited effects, sometimes non-significant effects. So we could say that, at least in the short run, we're not really confident that we have good effect sizes based on CO2 footprint labeling. However, and now we start a bit also with the very much disciplinary perspective, because what is typically done are not field studies in our field. You often see reviews that are done in with different kinds of experiments, and they are much more common than these field studies, right? So if you look at the review, and I showed you one here, then you can see the kind of study types that are typically used. And you may notice, without my help here, that choice experiments are the dominant one that are used, right? So the main issue here is that choice experiments, of course, they are great in terms of cost effectiveness. They're rather cheap. And they're great in terms of internal validity. So in terms of isolating effects, you can do that very well here. However, we have issues with external validity, and I will get into that. So first of all, to briefly explain to you choice experiments, in case you have not been exposed to that one, I will show you now one of these. So I thought, if I want to blame them, what better than to choose one of my own? So this is a choice experiment that is done with a menu choice where we have rice and peas, and then they can choose what they want to have with the rice and peas, whether they want 4 soy balls, the soy textured ones, whether they want just half the portion, 2 meatballs instead of 4 meatballs with the rice and peas, or whether they want the authentic vegetarian option, which would be 4 falafels, or whether they just stick to the 4 meatballs, how it used to be served before. And of course, you give substantial price discounts, and this one is also a bit a special one, because this choice experiment is designed in a way that whenever they stick to the original one, then all alternatives become cheaper, and whenever they choose one of the alternatives, all the alternatives become more expensive relative to the price here. But there are all kinds of special choice experiments that you can do, right? The main problem is that they are not ideal in terms of external validity, because they, of course, they predefine the kind of substitution options. Why would they not have chosen a salad? Of course, this is only substitution of ingredients within a dish, not giving the option to go to another dish. But there are all kinds of other behavior biases that we have in such choice experiments. And so I wanted to bring you a bit more on a broad overview here. So this is just the wall of behavior biases, but of course, this is a list that can be continued here. And many of these exist with many kinds of experiments, right? The main problem is that these biases, behavior biases, they exist on a spectrum, the same way like a p-value, right? There's a spectrum of it, and it can be more or less violated. And the main issue is that when we do these kind of very synthetic choice experiments, or all kinds of experiments that are very far-fetched from reality, that we even put that in a limitation. You can find many of these be mentioned in the limitations. But of course, they are violated to a larger degree than there are in some other studies. And that's something we do not properly count of. All right, so yeah, just giving you an idea here, attentional biases, right? In terms of it's paying attention to just 3 options or 4 options in a choice experiment is rather easy. Anchoring biases on how you compare to others is clearly there. Effect heuristics on emotions, how they are processed in a synthetic environment. Decision fatigue. If you go to a real supermarket and are exposed to so many more choice, then of course there's much more to be considered than in such a choice experiment. And we can even see that in very limited choice experiments, people have attribute non-attendance. A colleague of mine did look into that even if you have just 4 attributes, they could show with eye tracking that sometimes not even the 4 attributes are looked into. And yeah, salience biases, right? How salient certain options are and their attributes are, because they are the ones you're essentially comparing here. You assume that they play a role in the decision. Right, and unfortunately, we still have a bit limited evidence on how these compare. There are some now, also more than I show you here, but these are two key ones. I wanted to show you one that is from a colleague from mine at the ELA, David Wipper. And he actually looked into water use labels and looked into that with the choice experiment and found, hey, there's a price premium of €1.30 for buying coffee with a water use label. The same kind of experiment they did in a real online supermarket where the effects was non-significant. I have another colleague here, Laurent Müller from Grenoble. He actually had a bit a digital choice environment where he looked into the Nutri-Score effectiveness, and he had scanner data from several stores in France. And when he compared that, he actually found that the Nutri-Score effect in the digital environment was 40 times larger. They're both existing, right? I'm telling you, typically we find the right direction of effects with these kind of choice experiments. But we're talking about sometimes up to 40 times lower effect sizes, the more or the less real the environment gets. So in the end, we need more, and we have still very few real-world studies on CO2 footprints, especially also in the supermarket where most of the decisions should happen here. So just to give you an idea, because there are, of course, different kinds of settings that can make it more real, right? We can increase the realism here. And what we have here is virtual reality, which is a topic here that you've tried to make a more complex environment. And that basically has still the limitation that it's navigated very much depending on age. So in terms of navigation, it doesn't feel so natural, but at least it becomes a more complex choice environment. And we have, of course, any effort is probably a small improvement on the spectrum here, just a more pictorial show of the shelves, right? And when you make this choice, that you try to make it easier for consumers to imagine the situation that they are exposed to in the real world. And then you have online supermarkets, right? Because they are still less relevant in terms of overall what is sold on that channel, but at least they can be really realistic in the sense that consumers do know the patterns of how they make choices there, how you can filter, how you see the different options presented here. Right, and then there are the physical ones, right? So there's a brick and mortar store, which is the simple supermarket. And of course, we need more collaborations there. Of course, there are quite some limitations to how to do that, but they are usually fruitful in many ways. And then we have laboratory supermarkets, which is basically a smaller type of store where you have much more control, experimental control about isolating certain effects and so on. And we have, of course, laboratory shelves. This is also common also in neurosciences, that you just have basically shelves, and then you're measuring certain things while people try to comprehend this shelf or process that shelf in a certain way. And for this, actually, I have a bit of a systematic mapping review that is not published yet, which is one of the last things that came out of this project. And if you look at that and to these more realistic supermarket settings, what we see that this is very much dominated by the US. It's actually the public health domain that really makes the effort here to not just have this in their limitations, but to try to build more realistic environments and collaborate with more realistic environments in certain ways. And what you see in terms of product choice, and I said before, a colleague has actually defined complexity of a choice by the number of products and the number of product attributes that need to be considered. I don't think that is a perfect view, because it's still missing the importance of how that a trade-off becomes more complex, the more equal value you feel are between options, right? If an option is clearly inferior, it's much easier to choose. But it's a start, right? The direction is more or less all right. And we see that also in these in the systematic scoping, the systematic mapping review that we did. We see that real supermarkets, of course, they have typically more than 1,000 products to consider, right? And depending on, with decreasing realism, of course, this number goes down. But it's still much higher than it is in these typical experiments, like the auctions and the choice experiments that we had before. Yeah, what is typically done there, of course, it's a broad thing that we want to analyze there, but we see the nudging studies, we see stuff on product availability, on pricing strategies, we see stuff on consumer-related factors, and we see nutrition labeling, right? So these are also part there, and it's good that we have these studies. However, the share for environmental labeling studies is much lower, right? Then we talk about 13 studies now out of almost 400 here. So it was about 3.6%. Actually did that. So the evidence for the effects of the real effect sizes of CO2 footprint labels in a supermarket setting are still very limited. We also see that most of what we have on CO2 footprints actually comes from online supermarkets. So that is something that has been not in a real online supermarket, but at least having this design, right? To give the people the feeling they are shopping right now in an online supermarket, how they have been exposed to, if they have gone to Rewe online or just an Amazon setup to some degree. In the end, I think what we need much more is that we need to use these kind of findings from marketing and consumer behavior to not just look into product choice, but look also more into how people navigate that, the decision effort they have, how they pay attention, because that is something that can really help us with taking these steps from before, right? That we manage to take these steps and make CO2 footprint labels more effective at some point. Yeah, and so this is a bit an outlook because as I said, these are key reflections for me for the project, and it has also triggered some things. For example, we have been building up a laboratory supermarket at University of Bonn, which is at Prof Nord. And I want to acknowledge here the support because there was, of course, support from the central management to actually give us a facility. It's still being renovated at the moment in order to fit this kind of environment that you would expect from a supermarket. There's also support from TRA1 and TRA6 in terms of finding certain things within the store. And there's support from the humanoid robots lab, which has a bit of synergies with us here for doing research in such a laboratory supermarket environment. And this is a bit an outline because it still doesn't exist. Unfortunately, we hope that we can move in by summer. But honestly, this has also been postponed already over a year. Still, we are hopeful that it will be happening this summer. All right, but this would be how it looks like, right? That we have a store which is about 55 square meters. That's like a Rewe to go in terms of size. But you could enter it. You walk directly through vegetable shelves, fruits and vegetable shelves. Then you have also the option for impulse buys. You have a self-checkout, a cashier, and you also have the option to ignore shelves. But you also see dairy as typically something in the back of the store that you go through because you go there anyway. And there are many small details in that. Typically, consumers have to move right in supermarkets. But anyway, small details. Just be aware that this infrastructure should be existing during the year. And of course, there's also stuff you can do on online supermarkets. And we have also running a study where the results are not in yet for a CO2 footprint. Actually, here a master student, she actually worked with this online supermarket here and wanted to look into CO2 footprint labels. Of course, we use our color-coded labels. That should be clear by now. And we use them in a way to actually use food swaps. So this is typical, like what is done after your purchase. You get options. Don't you want to use that as well because it would fit with your purchase? But this time it's presented like a swap, so that you can. Don't you want, instead of the climate unfriendly one, here the climate friendly option? So we offer swaps that they can reject or accept, right? And this, of course, something you can easily do here. And there are a couple of product categories. Unfortunately, this one, I also don't have it in English yet, but you have yogurt products, you have milk products, cheese products, you have bread spreads, sausages, all kinds of stuff related to breakfast, because that was more or less the task here. Right, and yeah, to not leave you with a dim outlook on CO2 footprint label effectiveness, I want to highlight something here, and that is that the major effect of CO2 footprints is not consumer behavior. It's something we should not underestimate, because we see when we put CO2 footprint labels in a supermarket environment that we are constantly exposing people to information, right? And our food choices are very much habitual. At least in the short run, it's not expected that people will directly change their food habits. There goes family tradition, all kinds of stuff in that. However, if the information is constantly there, it's hard to ignore it. It will enter our interactions with others, social norms, discussions. It may even rationalize certain perceptions of how we perceive food, right? So in that sense, we will have more informed consumers, which can influence all kinds of things, right? In the long run, purchase behavior, and in short run, citizen behavior, how we support NGOs, how our voting behavior, all kinds of things here. And of course, the threat is already something that influences supplier choices. And this is a huge thing that we always highlight with labeling is reformulation, right? And reformulation is actually triggered a lot by these kind of labels. We see that in Belgium is a nice case study where they actually had the Nutri-Score when it was introduced there, that many companies like Nest and others had a look whether they can get their breakfast cereals from D to C, from C to B. It's just if they can just improve it in some way. And this effect in the short run is, of course, much larger than any consumer behavioral effect, right? But it will lead to some improvements here in our food value chains. All right, then I have a bit of conclusions for you. The main conclusion is don't expect too much in the short run from these kind of effects. However, I think it's clear that they have a widespread effect that we should utilize. And for that, we need more, or we need better research in consumer behavior here. We need more realism there, but we also need more work on these preconditions of successful labeling. And the last thing that I want to highlight here, that it will allow us to also ask better research questions and answer them in a more exact way, because we know that these kind of effect sizes matter here. We have also statistics. I think we are moving away from the idea of significance and know that effect sizes will be much more important here to guide priorities, right? And there you have research questions here. I put 3 out for you that, of course, are answered with more realism, much better, not necessarily a supermarket environment. Like, how would consumers behave if all products have a comparable carbon footprint label, right? Something we don't have at the moment. But what would happen if we have that? We don't have no idea, basically, at the moment. And you cannot do that in the supermarket. The supermarket cannot even demand that from their suppliers. It would not be lawful, right? Not to say that they are not caring about that. The other thing, it's about interactions, right? And I also highlight here, carbon footprints inform us, so they will have interactions. They may even pave the way for for CO2 taxes in the long run in the food domain, which of course we don't have at the moment, right? But maybe they are stepstone there. So here I put a research question on carbon footprint labels interacting with green scoreboards for consumers, something the more complex to make it, the less likely you're to get a retailer on board here, not talking about other restrictions there. And there's other things like how are consumers substituting products with negative carbon footprints? We see these negative carbon footprints, right? That's also why these color-coded labels are not always appreciated. But in the end, there's, of course, really not clear how they substitute. We have this debate also when we talk about sugar-sweetened beverages, all kinds of products, but because they substitute it in ways we do not expect. And it's certainly not something we can predefine easily in experiments that focus on just 2 or 3 alternatives. All right. Thanks for your attention.